So some people say sessions versus JSON Web Tokens, or sessions versus access keys. There's a lot of misnomers. It's not that. A web token can be used for anything for sessions, right? It's about the concept between the two different kind of logins. Instead of me hitting my database, like in a session with oAuth, I'm not going to be checking my database on every page, but I will be checking the access token on every page. If you like React, NextJS, full stack web development, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. React and Next.js logins can seem very daunting and confusing. In this video, what I'm going to do is explain exactly how logins work in a full stack app. Typically, I go in depth and I do these really in-depth tutorials, but in this one I wanted to take a little bit of a departure, and this is going to be a little bit high level conceptual discussion on how logins work in a full stack app. As long as you understand the concept, you can probably code it. And eventually I will have a tutorial. Now, I am trying something a little different. If you check in the description down below, I will have a link where I'll be doing a live coding workshop. So we're going to be basically covering a Next.js login app. We're going to be doing it together, and it's going to be a little bit of a different value because it's going to be not just a tutorial. We're actually going to be doing it in a live Zoom together. So if you're interested in that, go ahead, check that out in the description down below. It'll be like rolling dates, so catch the next one. But for now, let's dive deep into how logins actually work in React or Next.js. It's all the same thing, typically in a full stack app. So there seems to be a lot of confusion on, people say sessions, local storage, cookies, JSON Web Tokens. People keep mixing these things up, and you're like, sessions versus this and that versus this. The bottom line is, what I want you to understand is, in every full stack app, essentially there needs to be, your database is going to be always the source of truth. So your database is going to have the user login, the credentials, right? It's going to store the credentials. You're not going to store the actual password. So you might store an email, username, but you're going to store a hashed version of the password. And then on login, you're going to be hashing the text field of the password, cross-checking that, right? But we'll get to that in a second. So the source of truth is the database. Now, what needs to happen is a call needs to be made from a form that says, hey, here's the email, here's the password, I can submit in the form, cross-check into the database, and that basically tells you whether or not the user has succeeded and has the credentials to the real account. False, then they get nothing. If they have passed and they have the email and the correct password, the server has to give back something to the person, and it has to reside on the client. Now, that doesn't matter whether it's a cookie, local storage, session, blah, blah, blah. I mean, there is one that's better, and I'm going to get to that in a second, but the bottom line is something has to be stored on the client. There's really no way around, because otherwise, how does the server know that the person coming to the site, the person making the call, has anything? They have to have something stored on the client. Client meaning the browser or whatever it is that is making the call. So now let's talk about, now the key that I want you to realize is, one, the database is a source of truth that has the email, like the credentials that need to be verified. Two, the client needs to store something, some key, some value that says, yes, you've passed. Yes, this client has the right access, so that next time they want to access, they're good to go. So now I want to talk to you about the debate that people have where it's like this versus that. And that's typically, it works like this. Sessions versus oAuth, which is a different method. So there's both of them need to check credentials and give some to the client, but they both do it in different ways. So sessions, right? Let's talk about that first, and then stay tuned because I want to talk about the second way, which is actually the way I like to do it. I used to be a session, but I want to, cover this first, right? So because sessions is an interesting way to do it. So basically, now when we say session IDs, it doesn't necessarily mean session storage on the browser. It's just a verb. It's just a word people use to describe this. So basically, what happens is with session ID, the user enters the username and password. When the person passes, you're going to store some unique session, some session ID, whatever ID that you store in the database referencing this login has succeeded, attaching the user ID to it in the database, right? That's something stored. No one gets to look at it except it's in the database. Then you send that session ID back to the client in or whatever you want, local storage, cookie. Now, before we proceed, let's squash this. What you want to do is you don't want to use local storage. You don't want to use session storage. You need to use cookies. And what you want to use is an HTTP only cookies. I don't want to get too in depth. You could Google search this to death. Like, is local storage bad? It's not that it all has pitfalls, right? I mean, you could technically get away with using local storage, but what's going to happen is there are chances of, like forgery and cross attacks without getting too in depth on that. But cookies, no one can tamper with them. Like local storage can be tampered with, and cookies, you can tamper with them, but not the HTTP only cookies. HTTP only cookies are the ones that say this is only from the server. So that's pretty much a source of truth, that nothing really beats an HTTP only cookie. So that's what you want to use. Then here's what happens. On every single call, on every single page, you're basically hitting the database saying, hey, you're going to have a check on every page saying, pull that client side session ID, check the cookie, see what's in there, get the client ID, get the session ID, send to the database and cross check, hey, does this session ID exist for the user? Is there a potential connection? If there is, you're just letting the user continue. You're giving them access to the page. The advantage to that is that you almost have this like synchronous connection in real time with that value, with the user. So if you ever want to disconnect the user, you could always block that session. And since it's checking on every single page hit, the person basically will get, whoever, the user will just get denied access. They'll be logged out, because if in the database you say, hey, check the session ID if it exists, and also cross check that there's no block like in the database on it or something like that, then you could just basically redirect the user off the page or whatever. So you have this real-time control, right? Which is like, feels good to make sure that everything is safe. But the disadvantage is that you're pinging your database every single hit. That's the only way. So basically you're saying, I have ultimate control of this login because on every hit I'm checking it. But again, the big disadvantage, I don't know like what kind of resources you must have to be able to have every single user be able to use session IDs where you're pinging the database every single sort of like page load, right? That can get absurd. Now, if you have those resources, that's fine if you want to have that. But now let's talk about the second way. Now I've become a believer in this second way, which is JSON Web Tokens. Now you could still use JSON Web Tokens. That's another misnomer, is that you could use JSON Web Tokens for session IDs. Doesn't really matter. So before we get to the second side, which is going to be called oAuth, that's the second method we're going to be talking about for logins. But before we get to that, we're going to be using JSON Web Tokens. You can use JSON Web Tokens for the first side. The only thing in JSON Web Token is, encoded token in a special way that contains some values that there's a secret attached to it, so no one can really tamper with it without knowing the secret. And there's some information stored. You can use a JSON Web Token in a session. It doesn't really matter. Like basically you can create a JSON Web Token with that session ID we talked about earlier, and you're good. So some people say sessions versus JSON Web Tokens, or sessions versus access keys. There's a lot of misnomers. It's not that. A web token can be used for anything for sessions, right? It's about the concept between the two different kind of logins. The second method, let's discuss that. Now that we know what JSON Web Token is, right? And that's going to be automated in React and NextJS. There's going to be packages called JSON Web Token that'll create these tokens out of whatever objects of information you have. oAuth says, you know what? We're not going to be pinging our database every single time. Right? We want to protect our database, the resources. We don't want to have like that kind of like load on the database of every user pinging, because we want to have this control. So instead we relinquish some control and ping database every so often. How do we do that? By oAuth. oAuth says, okay, we're going to be checking, right? User's going to log in with the credentials. If they pass, we're going to create a JSON Web Token, but we're going to create two things that we're going to send to the client IDs. So one that we call an access key and one that we call a refresh token, or access token or refresh token. Access token, refresh token are just, they're not special things. They're just ways to reference this JSON Web Token that you're giving to the client, that you're putting on the client's browser. You passed. So I'm going to send you this token, and this token is already automatically created by the JSON Web Token NPM package. Now you could store in there. There's some debate on what you can store in there. People say don't store like things that are sensitive, which is for sure, you don't want to store passwords, but you can store like some IDs, maybe the person's email, a user ID, a session ID that some ID from the database, something that you can use to reference later on. The cool thing about the JSON Web Token is in and of itself, it'll have an expiration date, and you could check to see if that token is expired or not. And if it has the secret. So every JSON Web Token is going to be put together with the object of the data you want to put in there, as well as with a secret that no one knows except you. And that's why no one can really tamper with this JSON Web Token. You could open it, you could look at the data. So that's why you don't want to put sensitive stuff, but no one can tamper with the token, right? Because all a token is created, and that's really what's going to be checked. And you're going to check based on the secret, right? So that's the thing. Now, what's the point of getting two? What's the difference between access token and the refresh token? The access token is going to be one that expires quick, and the refresh token is going to last longer, but it'll also expire. So the concept is, I'll give you a token, but it's short-lived. In that token, I'm going to be checking. Now, instead of me hitting my database, like in a session with oAuth, I'm not going to be checking my database on every page, but I will be checking the access token on every page. So every page that's private, that needs to be logged in, I'm going to be checking, hey, do you have that token? But I don't have to hit my database. All I have to know, you already passed, you have this key. So I'm just going to be checking that token. So if you have that token, I'm going to load the page. What happens if the token is not valid? So the access token is going to expire. There's debates on how long you should let it expire. The idea is that you want it to be short-lived, right? Because in case now that we're not checking the database every hit, if this token, if something happens, if there's a bad actor, if you want to block it, you're not going to be able to block it because we're not checking the database. We're only checking the token. So if the user has it, they're going to be good and they could use it. And that's sort of the downfall, but it saves you from having to, that's only an event that there's like, again, an extreme case, right? So now the user can always access the system with the access token. Now, once that token expires, because we're only giving maybe a few hours of life, maybe a day of life, whatever you decide, then in whatever you check, you're going to say, hey, did the access token expire? Boom, it expired. Let's check the refresh token. The refresh token has the same information, but it's valid for a longer period of time. Now you want to hit the database, and what you could do is you could say that refresh token, when the person logged in, you could have stored some ID that's associated with that refresh token. So now is where we want to do a similar check to what we do with the session ID. We want to say, check the database. Now we have someone making a call. Their access token expired. So now we want to go into the database, say, this refresh token, is it blocked? Like, did we blacklist it? Right? And that's the cool thing, is you can blacklist the refresh token as long as you save some ID connected to it. Then we're going to say, no, it's not blocked. Yes. Okay. Let's just recreate the access token. And now all we do is just basically recreate and extend the access token again for another 6 hours, another day, or what have you. Then the refresh token, you never really renew, you leave it die. You leave it like basically get expired, because when your refresh token goes, that's when you want to say you're logged out. You need to now re-log in and pass this credential test, right? So I love this oAuth way because it does two things. One, it gives you some of the control, not total control, not like real-time control every minute that you can just block someone, but you have somewhat control, because after the access token expires, now you can hit your database maybe once a day for every user, maybe whatever you decide, but we're not hitting it every single page hit. So we can say, if there's a bad actor, we can say, you know what, that refresh token that has this ID in it, let's just block it. Let's blacklist it. So the next time we do that check comes in, it's blocked. So let me show you, like, for example, what happens here in this token. So here's like a demo, basic information here. You click sign in. I'm verifying all this. And then if you go to the cookies, we refresh, you see there's two cookies, secure and HTTP only. The front end, no one can ever access this or mess with this. And now there is one thing here, they're expired at the same time just for the demo, but what you want to do is have the SPL, like the first access token, whatever you want to call it, expire shortly, like maybe a day. And then the refresh one, you want it to expire longer, because the token is what you're going to be checking, to see if they're logged in all the time, but you don't want that to last for too long. You only want the refresh. If you take the value, like anyone could technically open this value and you're seeing the token hash, but you're not able to do anything with it. So if you paste it here, whoops, I don't know, the guy got the whole token. Here it is. So you can see here what I saved. I saved the user ID, the testing at email. This you don't need. There's some ID I set that's associated with in the database with the person in case I want to block them. And then there's the expiration date. Now this is, you see it says invalid because you don't have the secret token. Now you can read what's in the token, but you can't really create the token or edit the token, right? That's the point, unless you have the secret. This is why people say like, be careful what you're storing here, because technically anyone can open this and look at it, right? That's fine. And you decide, and to me, and that's not a problem, like for people to see certain things like IDs, and you'll have to make your own judgment on what you can store in there. That's been this, talk on React logins and how this works in full stack. And again, if you're interested, check the link down below where we should be having like a live workshop, and we'll do this tutorial on how to create a NextJS login together. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. I'll see you guys in the next video. Hit that like button and hit that and subscribe.